I thought I was just another broke college student working 3 jobs to pay rent, until a simple DNA test revealed I was heir to a multi-million-dollar empire I never knew existed. My name is Alex, and for 24 years, I believed I was the product of a teenage pregnancy that my parents couldn't handle. That's the story I grew up with anyway. Mom was 17 when she had me. Dad was 19, and they were just kids themselves trying to figure life out. We lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, where the walls were thin and the dreams were even thinner. Growing up, money was always tight. Remember countless nights eating ramen noodles for dinner, while Mom worked her second shift at the diner downtown. Dad picked up construction jobs when he could find them, but work was sporadic and the bills kept coming. We shopped at thrift stores, clipped coupons like our lives depended on it, and I learned early that asking for anything beyond the basics was a luxury we couldn't afford. But here's the thing about my parents. They loved me fiercely. Mom would stay up late helping me with homework even after working 12-hour shifts, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her voice still patient as she explained math problems for the 3rd time. Dad taught me how to change a tire, throw a baseball, and most importantly, how to work for everything I wanted in life. "Nothing comes free, kiddo," he'd say, ruffling my hair after we'd spent Saturday morning fixing the neighbor's fence for $20. School was my escape and my salvation. I threw myself into my studies with the kind of desperation that only comes from knowing education was my only ticket out of poverty. While other kids complained about homework, I devoured every assignment, every extra credit opportunity, every chance to prove I was worth something more than the circumstances I was born into. My grades were immaculate, not because learning came easily, but because failure wasn't an option. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, became my unofficial mentor during high school. She saw something in me that I wasn't sure I saw in myself. "You're college material, Alex," she'd tell me during our weekly meetings. "Don't let anyone tell you different." When it came time to apply for colleges, she helped me navigate the maze of applications, scholarships and financial aid forms that seemed designed to overwhelm first-generation college students like me. Getting into Ohio State University felt like winning the lottery. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I remember running 3 blocks to the diner where Mom worked just to show her. She cried right there in front of the lunch rush crowd, clutching that letter like it was made of gold. "My baby's going to college," she kept saying to anyone who would listen, her voice thick with pride and disbelief. But getting in was only half the battle. Even with financial aid, grants, and every scholarship I could qualify for, money was still impossibly tight. I worked at the campus bookstore in the mornings, waited tables at a restaurant near campus in the evenings, and picked up catering shifts on weekends. My schedule was brutal, but it was the only way to keep my head above water financially. My dorm room was a tiny space I shared with a guy named Marcus, who came from the opposite end of the economic spectrum. While I counted every dollar and survived on instant mac and cheese, Marcus casually mentioned spring break trips to Europe and summer internships his father had arranged through business connections. The contrast wasn't lost on me, but I tried not to let it breed resentment. We were just dealt different hands, that's all. During my sophomore year, something started eating at me. Maybe it was being surrounded by so many people who seemed to know exactly where they came from, who talked casually about family histories and generational wealth, or maybe it was just the natural curiosity that comes with growing up. But I began asking my parents more pointed questions about our family history. "Where are your parents, Mom? Grandma and Grandpa?" I'd ask during one of our weekly phone calls. There was always this awkward pause whenever I brought up extended family, like I was poking at a wound that never quite healed. "You know they died when you were little, honey?" "Car accident," she'd respond, but something in her voice always sounded rehearsed, like she was reciting lines from a script she'd memorized years ago. "What about Dad's family?" I'd press, and the conversation would inevitably shift to how I was doing in school, how my jobs were going, anything but the family tree that seemed to have no roots. The more I thought about it, the more questions multiplied in my mind. We had no photo albums from before I was born, no family heirlooms, no stories about great-grandparents or family traditions. It was like our family history started the day I was born, and everything before that was locked away in some vault I was unallowed to access. My friends talked about family reunions, about discovering old letters in their grandmother's attics, about learning they were descended from Civil War soldiers or Irish immigrants who came through Ellis Island. Meanwhile, I couldn't tell you my grandparents' names or what they did for a living. The absence of information became a presence all its own, looming larger the more I tried to ignore it. Junior year brought new challenges and new perspectives. I was taking a sociology class about family structures and generational trauma, and our professor assigned a project where we had to research our family history going back at least 3 generations. While my classmates were calling relatives and digging through family documents, I was staring at a blank family tree template with growing frustration. When I called Mom about the assignment, explaining that I needed information about our family history for class, she got unusually flustered. "Just make something up, Alex. It's not like anyone's going to fact-check it." But that wasn't the point. And making something up felt like betraying everything she and Dad had taught me about honesty and integrity. "Mom, I can't just fabricate my family history. Can't you at least tell me my grandparents' names? What they looked like? Anything?" The silence on the other end of the phone stretched. So long, I thought the call had dropped. "Some things are better left alone, sweetheart," she finally said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Trust me on this one. But I was 21 years old, paying my own way through college, and working myself to exhaustion to build a life my parents could be proud of. I felt like I deserved to know where I came from, even if the truth was complicated or painful. The mystery wasn't just about satisfying academic requirements anymore. It was about understanding the fundamental question of who I was. That conversation planted a seed that grew into an obsession. I started paying closer attention to things that had never seemed significant before. The way my parents would quickly change the subject whenever someone asked about extended family. How we never received Christmas cards from relatives or wedding invitations from cousins. The complete absence of any photographs in our house from before I was born. And late at night, between study sessions and work shifts, I'd find myself Googling variations of my parents' names, looking for any digital footprints that might lead to answers, birth records, marriage certificates, anything that might fill in the blanks of our family story. But every search led to dead ends, like my parents had materialized out of thin air the day I was born. The questions consumed me in a way that was starting to affect my grades and my relationships. My girlfriend Emma noticed I was distracted, distant, always lost in thought about something I couldn't quite explain. "What's going on with you lately?" she'd ask, and I'd try to articulate this growing sense that everything I thought I knew about my life might be built on some fundamental lie. "I just feel like there's something my parents aren't telling me about our family," I'd explain, but it sounded paranoid even to my own ears. Like there's this whole part of my identity that's been hidden from me. Emma, whose own family was an open book filled with embarrassing stories and too much information, couldn't relate to the mystery that surrounded my origins. "Maybe they're just private people," she'd suggest, but privacy was one thing. This felt like something else entirely. By the time I was finishing my junior year, the weight of not knowing had become unbearable. I was excelling academically, working multiple jobs and building toward a future that felt hollow because I didn't understand my past. The success I was achieving felt disconnected from any sense of legacy or belonging, like I was building a house on a foundation I couldn't see. That's when I first heard about DNA testing from my roommate's girlfriend, who had used one of those ancestry kits to discover she was part Scottish and part Cherokee. She showed us her results on her laptop. It's a colorful map highlighting different regions where her ancestors had lived, complete with potential relatives she'd never known existed. "It's wild," she said, scrolling through matches that connected her to distant cousins across the country. I found out my great-great-grandmother came from a tiny village in Scotland that I had never heard of. And look, there are like 50 people who shared DNA with me that I could potentially contact. The idea hit me like lightning. Here was a tool that could potentially answer every question my parents seemed determined to avoid. A way to uncover the truth about where I came from without having to navigate their obvious discomfort with the subject. It felt like finding a key to a door I'd been trying to open my entire life, but it also felt like a betrayal. Taking a DNA test behind my parents' backs seemed like the ultimate violation of their privacy and their clear desire to keep certain things buried. They'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had, worked themselves to the bone to support my dreams. And here I was considering going around them to get answers they obviously didn't want to give. The internal conflict kept me awake at night, weighing my desire to know the truth against my loyalty to the 2 people who had loved and supported me unconditionally. Was I being selfish and ungrateful, or was I justified in wanting to understand my own origins? The questions multiplied without any clear answers, setting the stage for a decision that would change everything I thought I knew about my life. The first crack in the wall of secrecy came during Thanksgiving dinner of my senior year. I was home for the holiday, exhausted from midterms and my part-time job at the campus library. We were sitting around the table, just the three of us, like always, when Dad started telling a story I'd never heard before. When Alex was about 2 years old, he began carving the turkey with the concentration of a surgeon. He used to do this thing where he'd line up all his toys by color. Not by type, not by size, but by color. Perfect little rows of blues, then reds, then yellows. "That's funny," I said, reaching for the mashed potatoes. "I don't remember doing that. Do you have any pictures of me organizing my toys like that?" Mom and Dad exchanged one of those loaded looks that married couples perfect over decades. It's the kind of wordless communication that can convey entire conversations in a single glance. It was Dad who finally spoke. We didn't have a digital camera, and film was expensive, but I'd been living with them for over 2 decades, and I'd never seen any boxes of old photographs. Every family photo in our apartment started from when I was around 5 years old, as if the first 5 years of my life had been somehow erased from the visual record. "Where exactly are they packed away?" I pressed, not maliciously, but with the kind of genuine curiosity that any normal person would have about their own baby pictures. Mom jumped in quickly, too quickly. "Oh, storage is such a mess. We keep meaning to organize it, but between work and everything else, ... Double quotes. The conversation moved on to safer topics. My grades, my job prospects after graduation. The weather, but something had shifted. That small exchange had pulled back a corner of a curtain I hadn't even realized was there, revealing a glimpse of something being hidden just out of view. Over the next few weeks, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. How they never talked about their wedding, never mentioned what it was like when Mom was pregnant, never shared those nostalgic stories that most parents tell about their child's early years. When I called them, usually twice a week, to check in and update them on my job search and upcoming graduation, I started asking more pointed questions. Not interrogating them, but gently probing the blank spaces in our family narrative. "What was it like when you first found out you were pregnant with me?" I asked during one of our Tuesday evening calls. "Oh, exciting and scary, like it is for any young couple," she responded. No specific details, no personal anecdotes, no mention of Dad's reaction or how they told their parents or any of the details that make a story real and personal. "What about when I was born? Was I early or late? Did I cry a lot? What was my first word?" These were the kinds of questions that most mothers could answer with the kind of vivid detail that comes from having lived through pivotal moments. But Mom's answers were vague, almost rehearsed. Like she was recounting events she'd heard about secondhand rather than experienced firsthand. "You were a good baby," she'd say. But something about the way she said it felt hollow. Like she was filling in blanks with what seemed reasonable rather than what she actually remembered. The more I paid attention, the more inconsistencies I noticed. Little things that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a picture of a family history that didn't quite add up. Dad would mention me doing something as a toddler that Mom had no memory of. Their stories about my early years lacked the kind of synchronized detail that comes from shared experience. But it was a conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, that really opened my eyes. I was visiting home for a long weekend in February when I ran into her in the lobby, and we started chatting about how quickly time passes. "I still remember when your parents first moved in with you," she said, adjusting her grocery bags. "You were such a quiet little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old. 4 or 5 years old when we moved in, but according to my parents, we'd lived in that apartment since before I was born. They'd always told me I'd come home from the hospital to that same small nursery that later became my bedroom. Mrs. Rodriguez had to be mistaken." I told myself, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile Mrs. Rodriguez's memory with the story I'd grown up believing. Maybe she was confused, mixing up our family with another one. Maybe I'd misunderstood what she was saying. But something in the certainty of her voice, the specific detail about my age and behavior, felt more authentic than the vague generalities I'd been getting from my parents. I started paying attention to the few physical remnants of my childhood that existed in our apartment. Lots of empty spaces where photos should be, milestone dates that were filled in with different pens, like they'd been completed all at once, rather than recorded as they happened. The medical records were another puzzle piece. When I needed my vaccination records for college, Mom had to request them from our family doctor, claiming the originals had been lost in a move. But we'd never moved, according to their story. And when the records arrived, they only went back to when I was 5 years old, with a note that said previous records unavailable. For a young adult who'd always been analytical and detail-oriented, these inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. I felt like a detective investigating my own life, uncovering evidence of something I couldn't quite name. The worst part was the growing realization that my parents, who had taught me the value of honesty and integrity, might have been lying to me about something fundamental for my entire life. My grades started slipping, as I found myself distracted during lectures, more interested in Googling my parents' names than paying attention to discussions about post-graduation career planning. Emma noticed I was becoming obsessive about my family history, constantly bringing up inconsistencies and contradictions that she couldn't help me resolve. "Maybe you should just ask them directly," she suggested one evening, as we studied together in the library. "Tell them you've noticed some things that don't add up, and you need honest answers." But every time I considered having that confrontation, I chickened out. What if there was an innocent explanation for everything? Worse, what if there was a dark secret, something so painful or shameful that my parents had spent decades protecting me from it? The questions reached a breaking point during spring break of my senior year. I was home for a week, ostensibly to help Mom organize some household tasks and spend quality time with my parents before graduation. But really, I was there to do some detective work. Not destructively, not violating their privacy in any malicious way, but looking for any evidence that might explain the gaps in our family history. Old bills, documents, anything that might provide a timeline or context for the inconsistencies I'd been noticing. What I found, or rather what I didn't find, was even more telling than any smoking gun would have been. There were no documents in our apartment from before I was 5 years old. It was as if our family's paper trail began in 1999, when I would have been 5 years old, exactly matching Mrs. Rodriguez's memory of when we moved into the building. In a box of important documents, I found my parents' marriage certificate, dated 6 months before I was allegedly born. But the certificate looked newer than it should have, the paper crisp and white rather than yellowed with age. When I looked closely, I noticed it was marked as a certified copy issued in 2001, 2 years after their supposed wedding date. Why would they need a certified copy of their marriage certificate 2 years after getting married? Why was there no original? The questions multiplied faster than I could answer them, each discovery raising more doubts about the fundamental story of how our family came to be. But it was finding my birth certificate that really shook me. The information seemed straightforward enough. My name, date of birth, parents' names, place of birth listed as Cleveland General Hospital. Except when I looked closely, something seemed off about the document. The paper stock looked different from other official documents from the same time period, and there were small inconsistencies in the formatting that made me wonder if it was legitimate. But questioning the authenticity of my own birth certificate felt like stepping into conspiracy theory territory, the kind of paranoid thinking that leads nowhere good. The final straw came when I decided to call Cleveland General Hospital directly. And after being transferred to several different departments, I finally spoke to someone in medical records. "I'm sorry," the woman said after checking their system, "but we don't have any record of that birth on that date." "Are you sure you have the right hospital? Is it possible the records were lost or destroyed?" "Our digital records go back to 1985, she explained. I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking as I stared at the birth certificate that suddenly felt like a piece of evidence in a case I didn't understand. Either the hospital had made a mistake, or the document I'd trusted my entire life was somehow fraudulent. These people who had raised me, sacrificed for me, loved me unconditionally, were suddenly suspects in some mystery I couldn't solve. Every casual comment about my childhood, every reference to events from my early years, felt potentially fabricated. The paranoia was eating me alive, but I couldn't bring myself to confront them directly. What if I was wrong about everything? What if there were innocent explanations for all the inconsistencies? But what if I was right, and everything I thought I knew about my origins was a carefully constructed lie? The weight of these questions was crushing, and I knew I had to find answers before it destroyed my relationship with my parents and my own sense of identity. But I also knew that getting those answers would require taking a step that might change everything forever. The idea of a DNA test, which had seemed like simple curiosity months earlier, now felt like the only way to uncover the truth about who I really was and where I'd really come from. The decision to take a DNA test didn't come all at once. It built slowly over weeks of sleepless nights and internal debates that left me feeling like I was betraying my parents just by considering it. I'd researched the different companies obsessively, reading reviews and comparing what each service offered. But I couldn't bring myself to actually place an order. The tipping point came in late April, just a few weeks before graduation. I was working my shift at the campus bookstore, mindlessly restocking textbooks and trying to focus on anything other than the questions that had been consuming me for months. That's when Professor Williams, who taught the sociology course where I'd first been asked to research my family history, stopped by to buy some supplies. "Alex, right?" she said, approaching the checkout counter with a stack of papers and a coffee that looked like it had been her lifeline through another long day of grading. "How did that family history project work out for you? I remember you seemed to be having some difficulty finding information." The question caught me off guard. It had been months since I'd turned in that assignment, cobbling together what little information I could verify and admitting in my conclusion that large portions of my family history remained unknown. I'd received a B- on the paper, more for effort than content, and I'd hoped the whole thing would fade into academic history. "It's still a work in progress," I said carefully, scanning the barcode on our notebooks. "Turns out family history is more complicated than I expected." Professor Williams nodded knowingly. "It often is. Families keep secrets for all sorts of reasons, some more valid than others. Have you considered DNA testing? I know it seems like a modern shortcut, but for people with gaps in their family knowledge, it can be incredibly revealing." She said it so casually, like she was suggesting I try a new restaurant or check out a book from the library. But the weight of the suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Here was a respected academic, someone whose judgment I trusted, essentially validating the path I'd been too afraid to take. "I've thought about it," I admitted, handing her the receipt. "But it feels like crossing a line somehow, like I'd be going behind my parents' backs." Professor Williams paused, studying my face with the kind of attention she usually reserved for particularly complex research questions. "Can I ask you something personal? Do you think your parents would be upset if they knew you were curious about your broader family history?" The question was simple, but it cut straight to the heart of my dilemma. Any normal parents would understand their child's curiosity about ancestry and genealogy. It's one of the most natural human impulses, wanting to know where you came from and who your people were. The fact that I felt like I had to hide this curiosity from them was itself revealing. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think they would be very upset." Professor Williams nodded slowly. That tells you something important right there, doesn't it? Normal family privacy is one thing, but when curiosity about your own origins feels like betrayal, there's usually a reason for that level of secrecy. After she left, her words echoed in my mind for the rest of my shift. She was right, of course. The very fact that I felt guilty about wanting to know my own family history suggested that there was indeed something to hide. Healthy families might have embarrassing stories or complicated relationships, but they didn't treat basic genealogical curiosity like a threat to national security. That night, I called Emma and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. I needed to talk through the decision with someone who knew me well enough to be honest about whether I was losing my mind or pursuing legitimate answers to legitimate questions. We met at our usual spot near campus, a coffee shop that stayed open late and had become our unofficial study headquarters over the past 2 years. Emma arrived before me, already armed with her usual order and a concerned expression that told me she'd been thinking about our recent conversations as much as I had. "Okay," she said before I'd even sat down. "Tell me what's really going on, and don't give me any more vague hints about family mysteries. What specifically is eating you alive?" So I told her everything. The inconsistencies in my parents' stories, Mrs. Rodriguez's comment about when we'd moved into the apartment, the missing documents and suspicious birth certificate, the hospital's lack of records. I laid out the evidence like a prosecutor presenting a case, watching Emma's expression shift from skeptical to concerned to genuinely alarmed. "Holy shit, Alex," she said when I finished. "That's not just family privacy. That's like witness protection program level secrecy." "But what if I'm reading too much into innocent coincidences?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been holding me back. "What if there are perfectly reasonable explanations for everything, and taking a DNA test behind their backs ruins my relationship with them forever?" Emma stirred her coffee thoughtfully, a habit she'd developed when working through complex problems. "Here's what I think," she said finally. "Either you're wrong, in which case a DNA test will put your mind at ease and show you're related to your parents like you always believed, or you're right, in which case you deserve to know the truth about your own origins." It sounded so logical when she put it that way. But logic didn't address the emotional weight of potentially discovering that everything I'd believed about my life was false. What if the truth is something awful? What if there's a reason they've been hiding it from me? "Then you'll deal with it," Emma said, with the kind of confidence I wished I felt. "You're about to graduate with honors. You've worked 3 jobs to pay your own way through college, and you're one of the strongest people I know. Whatever the truth is, you can handle it. But you can't handle not knowing much longer." She was right about that last part. Questions were consuming me, affecting my sleep, my concentration, my relationships. I was so focused on unraveling the mystery of my past that I was barely present for the final weeks of my college experience. Something had to give. "If I do this," I said slowly, "if I take the test, will you be there when I get the results? I don't think I can handle finding out alone." Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Of course, whatever we find out, we'll figure it out together." That weekend, I drove to a pharmacy about an hour from campus, paranoid about running into anyone I knew while making the purchase. The DNA testing kits were displayed near the pharmacy counter, colorful boxes promising to unlock the secrets of your ancestry and connect you with relatives you never knew existed. I stood there for probably 10 minutes, holding the box and reading the fine print about what the test could and couldn't reveal. The saliva collection seemed simple enough, and the processing time was 4 to 6 weeks. By the time I got results, I'd be graduated and starting my adult life with either confirmation of everything I believed or answers to questions that had been haunting me for months. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, noticed my hesitation. "Gift for someone?" she asked gently. "Something like that," I replied, handing her my credit card with hands that were shakier than I wanted to admit. Back in my dorm room that evening, I read through all the materials twice, making sure I understood exactly what I was signing up for. The test would provide ethnic background information, potential health insights, and most importantly, matches with other users who shared significant amounts of DNA with me. If I was adopted, if my parents weren't my biological parents, if there were siblings or other close relatives in the system, I would find out. The collection process was surprisingly simple. Spit in a tube, seal it up, mail it off, and wait. But as I sealed the package and prepared to drop it in the campus mailbox, the weight of what I was doing hit me fully. This small tube of saliva might contain answers that would change everything I thought I knew about myself. I almost chickened out 3 times on the walk to the mailbox. At one point, I actually turned around and walked halfway back to my dorm, before forcing myself to continue. This wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was necessity. The questions were destroying my peace of mind, and I needed resolution one way or another. Standing in front of the blue postal box, I thought about calling my parents one more time, giving them a final opportunity to tell me the truth voluntarily. But I'd already tried that approach in subtle ways, and their responses had only deepened my suspicions. If they were hiding something, they'd shown no signs of being ready to reveal it willingly. The mailbox slot seemed to stick for a moment when I tried to deposit the package, as if the universe was giving me one last chance to reconsider. But then it released, and I heard the package drop into the darkness below, carrying with it either the confirmation of my identity or the key to unlocking a mystery that had shaped my entire life. Walking back to my dorm, I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. The decision was made, the test was submitted, and there was no going back. In 4 to 6 weeks, I would have answers to questions that had been consuming me for months. Those answers might vindicate my parents and prove that my suspicions were unfounded, or they might reveal truths that would force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about who I was and where I came from. The waiting period ahead felt like it might be the longest month and a half of my life, but at least it would be finite. After years of unanswered questions and growing suspicions, I was finally going to know the truth about my origins, whatever that truth might be. For the first time in months, I slept soundly that night, exhausted by the emotional weight of the decision, but relieved to have finally taken action. The die was cast, the test was in the mail, and soon I would know whether I was Alexander Thompson from Cleveland, Ohio, son of Maria and David Thompson, or someone else entirely. The next few weeks passed in a blur of final exams, graduation preparations, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing your life might be about to change dramatically. I threw myself into my remaining coursework and job responsibilities, grateful for distractions from the constant mental countdown to results day. Emma helped keep me grounded during those weeks, reminding me to focus on the present rather than obsessing over unknowns I couldn't control. Whatever we find out, she kept saying, it doesn't change who you are as a person. It doesn't change that you're brilliant and hardworking and kind. It just fills in some blanks in your story. But even as I appreciated her support, I knew she was wrong about one thing. If the test revealed that my parents weren't my biological parents, if it showed that the fundamental story of my origins was false, it would change everything. Not who I was as a person, maybe, but certainly how I understood my place in the world and my connection to the people who had raised me. As graduation day approached and the DNA results grew closer, I found myself oscillating between hope and dread, sometimes within the same hour. Hope that I would finally have answers, dread of what those answers might reveal. The uncertainty was killing me, but the certainty that was coming might be even worse. The email arrived on a Thursday morning in June, exactly 6 weeks and 2 days after I'd mailed the test kit. I was sitting in the small studio apartment I'd rented near campus for the summer, drinking coffee and pretending to look through job listings online when my phone chimed with the notification that would change everything. Your DNA results are ready, the subject line read, and my stomach dropped like I'd just stepped off a cliff. I'd been checking my email obsessively for 2 weeks, refreshing my inbox multiple times per day despite knowing that the processing time could take up to 8 weeks. But now that the moment had finally arrived, I found myself paralyzed, staring at the notification on my phone screen like it might bite me. Emma was working her summer internship at a marketing firm downtown, but I texted her immediately anyway. Results are in. Can you come over? I can't do this alone. Her response came back within minutes. Leaving now. Don't open anything until I get there. The hour between sending that text and hearing Emma's knock on my door felt like the longest 60 minutes of my life. I paced around my tiny apartment, made another cup of coffee I didn't drink, and tried to distract myself with television that I couldn't focus on. Every few minutes my phone would buzz with another notification, and my heart would race until I realized it was just a random app alert or spam email. When Emma finally arrived, she found me sitting on my couch, laptop closed, staring at the wall like I was in some kind of trance. Okay, she said, settling in beside me and taking my hand. Whatever we're about to find out, we're going to handle it together. Are you ready? I nodded, though I wasn't sure anyone could ever really be ready for news that might fundamentally alter their understanding of their own identity. With shaking fingers, I opened my laptop and navigated to the DNA testing website, logging in with credentials I'd memorized weeks ago. The homepage loaded with cheerful graphics about discovering your heritage and connecting with family. I clicked on view results, and my heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. Emma squeezed my hand tighter as the page loaded, both of us holding our breath like we were about to witness something sacred or terrible. The ethnicity breakdown appeared first, and it was nothing like what I expected. According to my parents, we were a basic mix of Irish, German, and English, the kind of generic European-American background that half the Midwest claims. But the results showed something completely different. 34% Eastern European, 28% Italian, 19% Middle Eastern, 12% Greek, and 7% trace amounts of various Mediterranean regions. That's not possible, I whispered, staring at the colorful pie chart that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for how much it matched my supposed family background. My parents are both from Irish and German families. There's no Italian or Middle Eastern ancestry anywhere in our history. Emma leaned closer to the screen, studying the breakdown with the same intensity she'd applied to organic chemistry labs. Maybe your parents were wrong about their own backgrounds. Sometimes family stories get mixed up over generations, but I was already scrolling down to the section that would either validate my parents' story or blow it apart entirely. DNA relatives. The system had found matches with other users who shared significant amounts of genetic material with me, and the closest relationships were listed at the top. What I saw there made the ethnicity surprise look like nothing. The first match was labeled close family, first cousin, with 12.8% shared DNA. The name was listed as Catherine M., with a profile picture showing an elegant woman in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes. She lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, and her family tree showed surnames I'd never heard before: Castellano, Rosenberg, Dimitro. Below her were more close matches. Potential half-uncle with 10.2% shared DNA. First cousin once removed with 7.9% shared DNA. Name after name of people who were supposedly my close relatives, none of whom I'd ever heard of, living in places like New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Nowhere near Cleveland, Ohio. But it was the message indicator next to Catherine M's profile that made my hands start shaking uncontrollably. She had sent me a message through the platform, and I could see the preview. "Hello, Alex. I've been hoping to find you for years. Your father is my younger brother. Please contact me when you're ready to learn about your family." "Oh my God," Emma breathed, reading over my shoulder. "Alex." Click on the message. With fingers that felt disconnected from my body, I opened the full message. "Dear Alex, my name is Catherine Castellano, and if this DNA match is accurate, you are my nephew. Your biological father is my younger brother, Nicholas Castellano. We have been searching for you since you disappeared in 1999 when you were 5 years old. Your father never stopped looking for you, and neither did the rest of our family. I know this must be overwhelming and confusing, but please know that you have been loved and missed every single day for the past 20 years. If you're ready to hear the truth about where you came from, please call me at the number below. I promise you have a family who has never forgotten you. With all my love, Aunt Catherine." The laptop slid off my knees as I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window like I could somehow escape the words I'd just read. Emma caught the computer and continued reading, her face growing paler with each line. "Alex," she said softly, "there's more." She's attached photos and documents. I couldn't bring myself to look, but Emma described what she was seeing. Childhood photos of a little boy who looked exactly like me, but in clothes I'd never worn, in rooms I'd never seen, with people I didn't recognize. Official documents showing a missing person report filed in 1999 for Alexander Nicholas Castellano, age 5, newspaper clippings about a custody dispute gone wrong, a desperate father's search for his stolen son. The room was spinning, and I had to sit down before I fell down. Everything I thought I knew about my life, every assumption I'd built my identity on, was crumbling like a house of cards in an earthquake. I wasn't Alex Thompson from Cleveland, Ohio, son of Maria and David who'd struggled to make ends meet while raising their teenage pregnancy surprise. I was Alexander Castellano from Westchester County, New York. And according to the documents Emma was still scrolling through, I was the heir to a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Your biological father, Emma read from another attached document, is Nicholas Castellano, CEO of Castellano Properties, owns commercial real estate throughout Manhattan and the tri-state area. Your mother was Rebecca Hoffman, who died in a car accident when you were 4 years old. After her death, there was a custody battle with her sister, Maria Hoffman, who ultimately kidnapped you and disappeared. Maria Hoffman. The woman I'd called Mom my entire life wasn't some random stranger who'd found me. She was my mother's sister, my biological aunt. And David Thompson, the man I'd called Dad, had helped her steal me from my real father and hide me for 20 years. The emotional impact hit me like a physical blow. I doubled over, gasping for air as the magnitude of the deception became clear. My entire childhood had been built on a lie so massive and systematic that it involved fake documents, false identities, and the complete erasure of my real family and heritage. "There's a phone number," Emma said quietly, "and an email address. And Alex... there are photos of your father. Recent ones." She turned the laptop screen toward me, and I found myself looking at a man in his late 40s with graying dark hair and eyes that were unmistakably similar to mine. He was standing in what looked like a construction site, wearing an expensive suit and hard hat, but his expression was sad, haunted. The caption on the photo read, "Nicholas Castellano at the groundbreaking for the Rebecca Hoffman Memorial Hospital Wing, 2019. He'd named a hospital wing after my mother. My real mother, who I couldn't even remember because I'd been so young when she died. And he'd been looking for me all these years, building memorials and never giving up hope that someday he'd find his missing son." The crying started then, deep, wrenching sobs that felt like they were tearing me apart from the inside. Emma held me while I fell apart completely, mourning not just for the lies I'd discovered, but for the life I'd been stolen from. The father who'd spent 20 years searching for me, the family who'd loved me and lost me and never stopped hoping. When the initial shock began to wear off, anger took its place. White-hot, consuming rage at the people who'd raised me, who'd looked me in the eye every day for 20 years and lied about the most fundamental aspects of my identity. They'd stolen me from a father who loved me, erased my mother's memory so completely that I couldn't even remember her face, and condemned an entire family to decades of grief and loss. "I have to call them," I said, wiping my eyes and reaching for my phone. "I have to confront them right now." But Emma caught my hand before I could dial. "Wait, you're in shock, Alex. This is the biggest news anyone could ever receive. Maybe you should process this a little bit before you do something you can't take back." She was right. But the fury was so intense, I could barely see straight. "They kidnapped me, Emma. They stole me from my family and lied to me about everything for my entire life. My real father has been looking for me for 20 years and they knew it. How do I process that?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But calling them right now while you're this angry might not be the best way to get answers. What if you call this Catherine woman first? What if you learn more about your real family before you confront the people who took you from them?" The suggestion made sense, but I wasn't sure I was ready for more revelations. The information I'd already received was more than my brain could process. I had a biological father who was apparently wealthy enough to name hospital wings after people, a dead mother I couldn't remember, and an entire extended family who'd been mourning my disappearance for 2 decades. But Emma was right that I needed more information before I confronted Maria and David. I needed to understand the full scope of what had been taken from me, and what kind of life I was supposedly returning to before I burned down the only family relationships I'd ever known. With hands that were still shaking from adrenaline and shock, I picked up my phone and dialed the number Catherine Castellano had provided. It rang twice before a cultured voice answered. "Hello, is this Catherine?" I asked, my voice hoarse from crying. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Alex." "Todd!" "Oh my God, is this really Alex?" "I think so," I said, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. "I got your message through the DNA website. I need to know what happened to me." And through tears I could hear in her voice, my aunt began to tell me the story of who I really was, where I'd really come from, and what had been stolen from me 20 years ago when the people I'd trusted most in the world decided to erase my identity and build a new one from nothing but lies. The phone call with Catherine lasted 3 hours and left me feeling like I'd been turned inside out emotionally. She told me about my real mother, Rebecca, who had been an artist and teacher, someone who painted watercolors and read me stories every night before bed. She described my father Nicholas, who had been devastated by my mother's death and fought desperately to maintain custody when Maria claimed I'd be better off with her family. According to Catherine, the custody battle had been vicious. Maria argued that a grieving single father couldn't properly care for a 5-year-old, especially one who'd just lost his mother. She painted Nicholas as unstable and overwhelmed, leveraging his grief against him in court proceedings that stretched on for months while I lived in temporary foster care. The night before a custody hearing that would have likely returned me to my father, Maria and David had taken me from the foster home where I was staying. They told me we were going on a trip to see my daddy, but instead, they drove me to Cleveland, Ohio, where they'd prepared new identities and a completely fabricated life story. Father hired private investigators, offered rewards, never stopped looking. Catherine told me through tears that matched my own. But they'd planned this so carefully. New social security numbers, birth certificates, everything. It just vanished. By the time I hung up, I had contact information from my biological father, photos of the childhood I couldn't remember, and an invitation to come to New York whenever I was ready to reunite with the family that had never stopped loving me. But first, I had to confront the people who had stolen me from that family and lied to me about it for 20 years. Emma stayed with me through the night, both of us too wired and emotionally exhausted to sleep. We ordered pizza that neither of us ate and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was driving to Cleveland to confront Maria and David with the truth I'd discovered. "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" Emma asked as I packed a small overnight bag. "This is going to be intense, and you're already running on pure adrenaline." "I need to hear them explain this to my face," I said, Though my hands were shaking as I folded clothes, I barely registered selecting. I need to look them in the eye and ask them how they justified stealing a child and lying to him for 20 years. The 3-hour drive to Cleveland passed in a blur of nervous energy and rehearsed confrontations. A tactist, what I would say, how I would present the evidence, what questions I needed answered. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of standing on the doorstep of the apartment where I had grown up, knowing that the people inside had built their entire relationship with me on a foundation of lies and theft. Maria answered the door with the same warm smile she'd greeted me with thousands of times before, her face lighting up with surprise and pleasure at my unexpected visit. "Alex, what are you doing here, sweetheart? I thought you were working in Columbus this summer." Looking at her in that moment, knowing what I now knew, was like seeing a stranger wearing a familiar mask. This woman who'd packed my school lunches and helped with homework and stayed up with me when I was sick. She'd also stolen me from my real family and systematically erased my identity for 2 decades. "We need to talk," I said, my voice harder than I'd ever used with her before. "All 3 of us. Where's David?" Something in my tone must have alerted her that this wasn't a social visit. Her smile faltered slightly, and I saw her eyes dart to the DNA testing kit box I was carrying, evidence I'd brought to make sure they couldn't deny what they'd done. "He's in the living room watching television," she said slowly, stepping aside to let me in. "Alex, is everything okay? You look upset." I walked past her without answering, into the small living room where I'd spent countless hours doing homework and watching movies with the people I'd believed were my parents. David looked up from his recliner with the same pleased surprise Maria had shown, but his expression changed quickly when he saw my face. "What's wrong, son?" he asked, muting the television and giving me his full attention. Son. The word that had always made me feel loved and secure now felt like another lie, another piece of the elaborate deception they'd maintained for my entire conscious life. I sat down on the couch across from them, the DNA kit and printed emails from Catherine placed carefully on the coffee table between us. "I know who I really am," I said, without preamble. "I know what you did, and I need you to explain how you justified it." The silence that followed was deafening. Watched the blood drain from Maria's face as she stared at the documents I'd brought, while David went very still in his chair, like a deer that had just spotted a predator. "Alex," Maria said carefully, "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but—" "I'm not Alex Thompson," I interrupted, my voice getting stronger as I spoke. "I'm Alexander Nicholas Castellano. My real mother was Rebecca Hoffman, your sister, who died when I was 4. My real father is Nicholas Castellano, who's been looking for me for 20 years because you kidnapped me during a custody dispute and created false identities for all of us." Maria collapsed into the nearest chair like her legs had given out. David closed his eyes and put his head in his hands, and in that moment, their reactions confirmed everything I'd learned more definitively than any DNA test could have. "How?" David asked quietly, not bothering to deny the accusations. "DNA test," I said, pushing the kit across the table toward them. "My real family has been looking for me through every database and registry they could find. The moment I submitted my sample, they found me." Maria started crying then, not the gentle tears of someone who was sad, but the desperate sobbing of someone whose world was collapsing. "We never meant for it to go on this long," she said through her tears. "We thought it would just be temporary until Nick got his life together after Rebecca died." "Temporary?" I stood up, pacing to the window where I'd looked out thousands of times as a child, seeing my neighborhood with completely different eyes now. "You stole a child and created fake documents and moved to a different state. What part of that sounds temporary?" "You don't understand what it was like," David said, his voice defensive now. "Nick was falling apart after Rebecca's accident. He was drinking, couldn't hold it together, and you were just a little kid who'd already lost his mother. Maria was trying to protect you from my own father." I turned back to face them, anger making my voice shake. "From my biological family who loved me? You made that decision for me when I was 5 years old, and you never gave me the chance to make it for myself." "We gave you a good life," Maria said, wiping her eyes with tissues that were already soaked through. "We loved you like our own son. We worked multiple jobs to put you through school, supported your dreams, never treated you like anything other than our child, and that was the cruelest part of all. They had loved me in their way. They'd sacrificed for me, been proud of my achievements, comforted me through teenage heartbreaks and academic stress. But all of that love had been built on the foundation of a crime, a fundamental violation of my right to know who I was and where I came from. "You stole my identity," I said, sitting back down because my legs were shaking too much to keep standing. "You erased my mother from my memory so completely that I can't even remember what she looked like. You condemned my real father to 20 years of not knowing if I was alive or dead. How do you justify that level of destruction?" "The custody hearing was going to give you back to Nick," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he wasn't capable of taking care of you then. He was drinking heavily, missing work, couldn't even take care of himself." The social workers were concerned. "But the judge was going to rule in his favor anyway because he was the biological father. So you decided to play God," I said. "You decided what was best for me, without considering that maybe my father deserved the chance to heal and raise his own son." David leaned forward, his face earnest in the way it had been when he'd given me advice about life and relationships and making good choices. Except now I knew that his entire relationship with me was based on the worst choice anyone could make. "We saved you from growing up in chaos," he said. "Nick's family had money, but money doesn't make someone a good parent. You needed stability, consistency, people who would put your needs first." "His family?" I pulled out the printed information Catherine had sent about the Castellanos, about the real estate empire and the hospital wings and the scholarship funds established in my mother's name. "You mean the family that spent 20 years and probably millions of dollars trying to find me? The family that built memorials to keep my mother's memory alive? Those people who didn't deserve to know I was safe?" The weight of what had been stolen from me was crushing. Not just the material wealth, though learning I was heir to hundreds of millions of dollars was staggering enough. But the relationships, the connections, the sense of belonging to something larger than myself. I'd grown up believing I had no extended family, no history, no legacy beyond two people struggling to make ends meet. Meanwhile, I had grandparents who'd died not knowing if their grandson was alive, cousins who'd grown up with my empty chair at holiday dinners, father who'd probably blamed himself for my disappearance every day for 2 decades. "We were going to tell you," Maria said desperately. "When you turned 18, when you were old enough to understand and make your own decisions about whether to contact Nick." "I'm 24 years old," I said flatly. "When exactly were you planning to let me know that my entire life was built on lies?" The question hung in the air without an answer, because we all knew there was no good answer. They'd never planned to tell me. They'd hoped to carry the secret to their graves, leaving me to live my entire life as someone I wasn't, cut off from my real heritage and identity. "Do you have any idea what this has done to my father?" I asked, pulling up a photo Catherine had sent of Nicholas at a candlelight vigil held on the anniversary of my disappearance. "Look at this man. Look at what 20 years of not knowing did to him." Maria glanced at the photo and started sobbing harder. "We sent him letters," she said through her tears, "anonymous letters, letting him know you were safe and happy. We never wanted him to suffer. Anonymous letters." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. You let him know his son was alive, but not where he was or if he'd ever see me again. That's supposed to make it better. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the kitchen, like he needed to put physical distance between himself and the conversation. "We made the best decision we could with the information we had," he called back. "Nick wasn't capable of being a father then isn't now," I shouted, following him into the kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals together. "He's a successful businessman who spent 20 years getting his life together and looking for his son. But you never gave him the chance to prove he could be the father I deserved." The argument continued for hours, circular and devastating, with Maria and David alternating between justification and apology, while I tried to process the magnitude of their betrayal. They'd stolen my childhood, erased my mother's memory, and condemned an entire family to decades of grief and loss. And they'd done it all while looking me in the eye every day and telling me they loved me. By the time I left Cleveland that evening, nothing was resolved. Maria and David were broken. Their carefully constructed world of lies finally collapsed, but there was no way to undo 20 years of deception. I couldn't get back the childhood I'd lost with my real family, couldn't restore the relationships that had been severed, couldn't ease the pain my father had endured thinking his son was gone forever. As I drove back toward Columbus in the darkness, I knew that calling Nicholas Castellano and arranging to meet my biological father would be one of the hardest things I'd ever have to do. But it was also the first step toward reclaiming the identity that had been stolen from me in beginning. to heal the wounds that 20 years of lies had created. The first phone call to my biological father lasted only 3 minutes. I'd rehearsed what I would say during the entire drive back from Cleveland, but when I heard his voice say hello, I could barely choke out the words. "Mr. Castellano. This is Alex. Alexander, your son." The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard what sounded like a grown man crying, and my own tears started again before he could even speak. "Alex," he whispered, and something about the way he said my name, not like he was meeting me for the first time, but like he was welcoming me home after a long journey, broke something open in my chest that I'd been holding closed for weeks. We arranged to meet the following Saturday at a restaurant in Manhattan. Neutral territory where we could see each other without the pressure of family gatherings or formal reunions. I drove to New York in the same car I'd used to confront Maria and David, but this time the journey felt like traveling toward something instead of running away from it. I recognized him immediately when I walked into the restaurant, even though the last photos I'd seen of him showed a man 20 years younger. He looked older than his 51 years, with silver threading through dark hair that had once matched mine exactly, and lines around his eyes that spoke of years of worry and searching. But when he smiled, when he stood up from the table and held out his arms uncertainly, I saw myself in him in ways that went beyond just physical resemblance. "You're so tall," he said. And it was such a perfectly dad thing to say that I almost laughed despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "You were barely up to my waist when I last saw you." We sat down across from each other, both of us crying and trying to pretend we weren't. Both of us unsure how to navigate a relationship that was simultaneously the most important connection we'd ever had, and a conversation between two strangers. "I never stopped looking," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you to know that. Not a day went by that I didn't think about you. Didn't wonder if you were safe and happy and growing up somewhere I couldn't find you." "I know," I said, wiping my eyes with the restaurant's cloth napkin. "Catherine told me about the private investigators and the reward money and the ... I had to pause to collect myself. "The hospital wing you built for Mom." His face lit up when I mentioned Rebecca, and he pulled out his phone to show me photos I'd never seen. My mother holding me as a toddler, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. Family photos from Christmases and birthdays and ordinary moments that had been stolen from my memory along with everything else. "She would have been so proud of you," he said, scrolling through image after image of the life I should have remembered. College graduate, working your way through school, making something of yourself despite everything you've been through. The conversation was stilted at first, both of us trying to bridge 20 years of separation with small talk and careful questions. Gradually, as the afternoon wore on, something natural began to emerge. He told me about the family business, about how building things had been his way of coping with loss and uncertainty. I told him about my studies, my work ethic, the values that Maria and David had instilled in me even as they'd lied about everything else. "I'm angry at them," I admitted as we shared dessert. Neither of us was really eating. "But I'm also grateful for parts of what they gave me." "Does that make me a terrible person?" Nicholas shook his head firmly. "It makes you human. They stole you from me, and I'll never forgive them for that. But they also raised you into someone I'm proud to call my son. The situation is complicated, and your feelings are allowed to be complicated too." That permission to feel conflicted, to hold anger and gratitude simultaneously, was something I hadn't realized I needed. For weeks, I'd been torturing myself with the idea that appreciating anything about my upbringing was somehow betraying my biological family. But Nicholas understood that the reality was more nuanced than that. "What happens now?" I asked as we prepared to leave the restaurant. I know I have legal rights to the family business and everything, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this information. "Whatever feels right to you," he said simply. "I'd love to have you in my life, in whatever capacity you're comfortable with. I'd love to introduce you to your grandparents, before they get any older, and your cousins who've grown up hearing stories about their missing cousin. But I also understand if you need time to process everything before you're ready for family gatherings." The next few months were a careful dance of getting to know each other. While I tried to figure out where Maria and David fit into my new reality, I didn't cut them off completely, though part of me wanted to. They'd raised me, sacrificed for me, been the only family I'd known for 20 years. But every conversation with them was now filtered through the knowledge of what they'd done. And the relationship we'd had was irreparably changed. Nicholas, meanwhile, was patient in ways I hadn't expected. He didn't pressure me to immediately step into the role of heir apparent to his business empire. Didn't expect me to erase 20 years of another life and instantly become the son he'd lost. Instead, he let me set the pace, answering questions when I asked them and giving me space when I needed to process. The rest of the Castellano family was less subtle in their excitement. Catherine wept openly when Nicholas brought me to her house for Sunday dinner, telling me stories about my mother and showing me photo albums I'd never seen. My cousins, who ranged in age from teenagers to adults with children of their own, welcomed me with the kind of unconditional acceptance that only family can provide. But it was meeting my paternal grandparents that really drove home what had been stolen from all of us. Anthony and Rose Castellano were in their 80s, and when Nicholas walked me into their house and said, "Mom, Dad, this is Alex," my grandmother collapsed into a chair and started praying in Italian through her tears. "My grandson," she kept saying, reaching for me with hands that shook with age and emotion. "My beautiful grandson, you came home." They'd kept my room exactly as it had been the last time I'd visited as a 5-year-old, they told me. 20 years of hoping I'd come back someday, keeping my space ready like I might walk through the door at any moment. The toys were still there, the clothes I'd outgrown decades ago, pictures of me as a little boy covering every surface. It was overwhelming and heartbreaking and beautiful all at once. These people had loved me and mourned me and never given up hope, even when every rational indicator suggested they should. And now, in the final years of their lives, they had their grandson back. The legal aspects of my return were complicated, but ultimately straightforward. I was Nicholas Castellano's son and heir, entitled to everything that came with that identity. But more importantly, I was part of a family that had missed me for 20 years and was determined to make up for lost time. I started working at Castellano Properties part-time, while I figured out my long-term plans, learning about the business my father had built while searching for me. Every building we owned, every development project we'd completed, had been part of his way of coping with loss and channeling his grief into something productive. Now with me back, he was excited to share not just the business, but the purpose behind it. "I want to build something that lasts," he told me one day as we stood on the roof of a new mixed-use development in Brooklyn, looking out over the city that was supposed to be my birthright. "Something that creates value for the community and provides for our family for generations to come. You're part of that legacy now if you want to be." The transition wasn't without challenges. I had to learn an entirely new family history, remember names and relationships and inside jokes that had developed over 20 years of my absence. Sometimes I felt like an imposter at family gatherings. Like everyone else shared memories and connections that I'd been locked out of through no fault of my own. But slowly, month by month, I began to feel like I belonged. Nicholas and I developed our own relationship, separate from the grief of our separation and the joy of our reunion. We discovered we shared similar sensibilities about business and ethics, similar dry senses of humor, similar values about hard work and giving back to the community. The financial aspects of my inheritance were staggering and honestly difficult to process. I'd grown up counting every dollar, working multiple jobs to pay for necessities, and now I was worth more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. But Nicholas was wise about helping me navigate that transition, emphasizing that wealth was a responsibility rather than just a privilege. "Money doesn't change who you are," he told me, "but it does change what you're capable of doing for other people. The question is what kind of impact you want to make." That perspective helped me find purpose in what could have been an overwhelming windfall. We established a scholarship fund in Rebecca's name for first-generation college students, funding the kind of educational opportunities I'd had to fight for, but that other deserving students could receive more easily. We also created a foundation focused on supporting families affected by parental kidnapping, providing resources and assistance to parents and children dealing with the kind of trauma our family had experienced. As for Maria and David, our relationship remained complicated. I couldn't bring myself to completely cut them out of my life, but I also couldn't pretend that nothing had changed between us. They'd shaped me into the person I'd become, instilled values and work ethic that served me well in my new life. But they'd also stolen something precious from me and from my biological family. We eventually developed a kind of cautious peace. I saw them occasionally, usually on neutral ground, and we maintained polite but distant contact. They never stopped apologizing for what they'd done, and I never stopped struggling to fully forgive them. It was an ongoing process that I worked through in therapy, learning to hold both gratitude and anger, love and betrayal, in the same space, without letting either set of feelings consume me. 2 years after I first submitted that DNA test, I stood as best man at my cousin Michael's wedding, surrounded by family members who'd waited 20 years to see me in a family photo again. Nicholas gave a toast that mentioned how grateful he was to have his family complete again, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped feeling like a visitor in their lives and started feeling like I belonged. The woman I'd been dating, someone I'd met through work who knew my whole complicated story, squeezed my hand during the reception as we watched my grandparents dancing together with the kind of joy that comes from seeing prayers answered late in life. "No regrets?" she asked. And I knew she was asking about more than just the wedding. I thought about it seriously before answering. The life I could have had, growing up as Alexander Castellano, with wealth and privilege and an intact family, the relationships I'd missed, the security I'd lacked, the years my biological father had spent grieving my absence. But I also thought about the work ethic I'd developed struggling to pay for college, the resilience I'd built overcoming challenges that money couldn't have solved, the appreciation for opportunity that came from growing up without guarantees. "No regrets about learning the truth," I said finally. "Some sadness about what was lost, but no regrets about finding my way home now." When people ask me about my story, about how I discovered I was heir to a fortune I never knew existed, I tell them it was never really about the money. It was about identity, about belonging, about understanding where you come from, so you can figure out where you're going. I look at my father now, graying but proud, building something lasting for future generations, and I see the man I'm becoming. I think about my mother, who I'm still getting to know through stories and photographs. I carry her memory forward in ways that honor both the life she lived and the son she'd want me to become. The DNA test that started this journey was supposed to answer simple questions about ethnicity and ancestry. Instead, it gave me back a family I'd lost, a heritage I'd been denied, and an understanding of myself that no amount of money could have purchased. Most importantly, it